We had another state election recently in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and the results reflect the growing sentiment of discontent with the federal government in Berlin, and more specifically with Merkel. The results are Social Democrats 30.6%, AfD 20.8%, Conservatives 19%, the Left 13.2%, Greens 4.8%, Liberal Democrats 3%, NPD 3%. Compare this to the previous election results in 2011 and you will see the massive change which this election brought to the structure of power in the Mecklenburg-Vorpommern State Senate. In terms of the state government, not much is going to change. The Social Democrats, who received most of the vote, will probably pick a coalition partner to form a government for the next 5 years, and that coalition partner will probably be the Conservatives, with whom they had governed over this state for the prior 5 years. But the success of the AfD will without a doubt have a big impact also on a federal level. This is the first time this party ran in this state, and to immediately gain 20% is quite the achievement and catapulted the party into the position of being a potential coalition partner and possibly even a leading party in some states. More seismic than that is the fact that the Greens got kicked out of the state Senate by not receiving enough votes, and that the Liberal Democrats didn't make it back into the Senate, where they haven't been since 2006. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats used to be the two main small parties who were chosen as coalition partners by the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. The Greens have only been involved in German politics since the 1980s, when they, and similar to the AfD today, crashed into German politics on a state and federal level and were at first looked down upon as far too radical left-wing as a party. The Liberal Democrats have been around since the founding of the Republic and have been coalition partners of both the Social Democrats and the Conservatives. With both these parties being out of the state Senate, it is now a certainty that a party's place in a state Senate is no longer a guaranteed certainty. In German politics, most political parties used to rely on a certain voter bloc that would always, under any circumstances, vote for them, and then focused most of their attention on trying to sway a small group of undecided voters. The traditional voting blocs, however, seem to be collapsing more and more people seem to have less of a problem with changing who they vote for in the next election. With that, the size of the undecided voter bloc has grown, which will from now on force political parties to engage those blocs more, rather than relying on any kind of traditional voting bloc. But probably the biggest damage done in this election was inflicted on the Conservatives, both in the state but more crucially also in the federal government. Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is Merkel's home state, and that state where she comes from has now relegated her party to third place, behind a party which mainly campaigned against an issue that she was most vocal in support of: her open borders policy. This was a clear message to Merkel by voters that her policy is clearly being rejected. I'm pretty sure that she believed that with her policies during the refugee and migrant crisis, she would be capable of swaying some left-leaning voters to come and vote for her party. But the results show that the core of those voters remained as voters for left-leaning parties, and that even the left-leaning parties had to take big losses during this state election. On a national level, the EFD is projected to possibly be the third largest party in the country come the 2017 federal election. Granted, a lot can happen until then, and the polls would still project a Social Democrat Conservative coalition government to be the result of the next federal election. But this change in German politics is still massive. Merkel's initial reaction was to get involved in the election campaigns for the Berlin State Senate and mayor elections that are due for the 18th of September. It is pretty much a given that those elections will be won by the Social Democrats, but despite this, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chancellor's involvement in the state politics is starting to become a liability for her own party. I've mentioned this a couple of times before. Being the Ministerpräsident or governor of one of the German states, or a mayor of one of the free city-states, comes with a lot more political power than being a governor of a state in the US. As such, these state elections in Germany are hard fought for, and it is important, especially for the parties in charge of the federal government, to make big gains and to avoid heavy losses. We still have state elections in Berlin, Saarland, Schleswig-Holstein and Nordrhein-Westfalen coming up. All of those states are ruled by Social Democrats, with the exception of Saarland, which is ruled by the left. If you remember the video I made for Sargon's channel, the guy in the beginning of it is the one standing for re-election. So the remaining elections will be more of a test for the country's left-leaning parties and their stance on the recent crises. But still, if the Conservatives make big losses in those 4 upcoming elections within the next 9 months, especially if Merkel decides to personally get involved in the campaigns, I can see her party increasingly seeing her as a liability. Within the ranks of the Conservative Party outside of Berlin, dissent against her decisions last year during the refugee and migrant crisis has existed from the start, most vocally in Bavaria. And the governor of that state, Horst Seehofer, is now even more vocal and open with his attacks on Merkel and her policy decisions, lamenting that the situation of the Conservative Party is very threatening and that people do not want this style of Berlin politics. With the Social Democrats also becoming increasingly vocal in their criticism of Merkel, proclaiming that her era is over, and some within the party also being increasingly displeased with the leadership of their own party, it is becoming increasingly more likely that Merkel will not survive the next election cycle. If the Conservatives make massive losses during the state elections, I think she will be replaced by someone else from the Conservative Party. If the Conservatives make massive losses during the federal elections, I think she will be replaced by someone else from the Conservative Party. And possibly, if she continues her current course of action and policy, I think she might also be replaced by someone else from the Conservative Party. And increasingly, that person who would start this process seems to be Horst Seehofer. As for the AfD, the way things are currently going, they might possibly get enough votes in the upcoming elections to be a viable coalition partner. Traditionally, it has always been the Bavarian section of the Conservatives, the sister party CSU, that has taken the role of the right-wing faction of the Conservatives. This role, however, is now being gradually undermined and taken from them by the AfD, which might also be a contributing factor to the increasing displeasure of the Bavarian Conservatives with the conservative establishment in Berlin. The way the media has reacted to this has been somewhat amusing, from Der Spiegel making an analysis video in which they merely keep repeating that the party is just a bunch of racists, to a commentary in that site which is more level-headed. Most of the media attention was focused on how damaging this was for Merkel rather than reporting on the AfD. And I find it interesting when people call the AfD the racist party in context of this election cycle, since an actual racist party, the NPD, which is a collection of Nazi skinheads, were kicked out of the state Senate following their big fucking loss. I have mentioned this countless times before. The AfD is a right-wing party, a party that I wouldn't agree with on a majority of its issues, but it still is a democratic party and not the fascist collectivist bunch of skinheads that some try to paint it to be. If you read their party program, it is almost a copy of the Conservative Party program from 20 years ago, and the party really is nothing more but the result of the CDU moving more towards the middle under Merkel and the right starting to split off. It's a German version of UKIP, essentially. And the popularity of this party can, by a large extent, really only be blamed on those who are in opposition to it. Refusing to engage in debate and resorting to simply calling that party a racist party, its members racist and its voters racists, hasn't done any of them any favours and has possibly even contributed to the success of that party. In a democracy, you talk with people and not down to people, and I guess the success of the AfD proves this. By constantly talking down to people who are critical of the open border policy, and by talking down to people by maligning all those in support of the AfD as racists, the result has been that the electorate resented being treated like children. As for the future, it is rather hard to tell what will come next. Will we see Merkel overthrown by an internal revolt in her party? Will we see her changing course? Will we see her successor changing course? Will we see similar internal revolts within the Social Democrats, the Greens and the left? Will we see the Liberal Democrats ever recover? Will the success of the AfD die off, or will they continue to win and potentially become a coalition partner? We will have to wait for the next few state elections to conclude to see what will happen.